Hey everybody, it's Kristen from Magoosh. Welcome to another episode of Tuesday CT. Today we are going to talk about how to compare your ACT scores and your SAT scores. Okay, so let's say you have an ACT score and it looks like this. And then you have an SAT score and it looks like this. It's like apples and oranges, except it's a peach and banana because I didn't have any apples or oranges. Okay, so you get the point. Let's say, really, you have an ACT score that looks like this, and you have an SAT score that looks like this. So how do you compare these two very different numbers? Okay, so there is a simple answer, and then there's a Messier answer. Let's talk about the simple answer first. If you just want to know how to compare an ACT score to an SAT score, you just want the numbers, well, there is a link below this video for the official SAT, ACT concordance table, which is really just a fancy name for a conversion table that will show you your a list of ACT scores and then the SAT scores they correspond to right next to them. So if you want to check that out and you're done, go ahead. All right, so the Messier answer is that because the ACT has a much more limited range of potential scores than the SAT, so the current SAT is scored from 600 to 2400. That's going to change soon with the new SAT, which is going to be from 400 to 1200, but still, there's a much wider range of scores. So the ACT goes from 1 to 36 in 1-point increments, the SAT goes through hundreds of numbers in 10 points increments. So that means that technically when you're comparing the scores, you could have something that's like a low 28 on the ACT and a high 28 on the ACT. It's going to correspond to a range, a slight range of SAT scores. Honestly, that's really not much for you to worry about unless you're talking about comparing, or unless you're talking about applying to really competitive schools. There's far less students that get a perfect score on the SAT than the ACT, for example. But most of all, you don't really want to worry about, or for most people, you don't really want to worry too much about it. The key question, if you were looking at comparing a score that you receive on the ACT practice test and an SAT practice test, is this: which score is going to be easiest to move? Okay, so what do I mean by that? So you shouldn't necessarily just look at an ACT practice test, an SAT practice test, and necessarily go with a test that you have a higher score on. Now, for most people, or for some people, I should say, there's going to be a clear difference. There's going to be a huge point gap, and it's going to be obvious which test you should take. But for most people, you're going to find that your SAT score and your ACT score are probably going to be pretty close, and you don't necessarily just want to jump on the test you got a higher score on. What you want to do is think about where those scores came from. So let's say, for example, you've taken the PSAT a couple times, well then you likely have a familiarity with the SAT that's going to help your score jump up a little bit more than if you just took the ACT cold. Or maybe you took an ACT practice test and you didn't know you were allowed to guess, or you didn't know there was no penalty for guessing on the questions. So you want to think about where those scores came from and really make sure you're doing a fair evaluation comparing your scores. And if in doubt, you can prep for both of them, at least for a little bit, and see which test has a score that moves more. Now, the other thing you want to think about, particularly if your test date is coming up soon, is which score can you move the fastest. If you only have a couple months, for example, a lot of students think that the ACT science section's a lot weirder or would be a lot harder for them to get good at than just learning some grammar rules for the SAT writing. So if you have 1 or 2 sections that's really pulling down your score, you want to think about which is the easiest for you to improve upon quickly, and that may be different for everybody with regards to the SAT or the ACT. So the moral of the story is don't just necessarily jump on whichever test you get the highest score on when you do a practice test for the first time. Really think about where those scores come from and why you got the scores you did so that you can make a fair comparison. And that is another Tuesday CT in the bag. I will see you next week.